Welcome, Jinpa. It's a great honor to have you with us. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. There are thousands of people tuning in from all over the world to hear this discussion and dialogue. We're really honored to have you with us. I'm just going to say a few words of by way of introduction. This is Jinpa La, as you will soon learn, is the kind of individual who you could probably spend an hour and a half listing all the amazing things he has accomplished in his life. He is truly completely and utterly unique on this planet. So Jimbala was a monk from a young age, and he eventually found his way to Ganden Monastery in the south of India. This is, for those of you who haven't heard of Ganden, is really one of the premier, most famed, historic lineages within Tibetan Buddhism. And it's especially known for its incredibly deep and rigorous monastic training in Buddhist philosophy. So he eventually received his Geshe degree, and not only that, received the Tlarampa distinction, which is kind of like the very highest distinction you could receive. And the Geshe degree is almost like a PhD on top of a PhD. It's years and years of incredibly rigorous philosophical study and monastic training, monastic discipline. So as if that wasn't enough, he then went on to receive a bachelor's degree and a PhD from Cambridge in religious studies. So deeply trained both in the traditional Buddhist philosophical tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, but also in Western scholastic and academic training. So has this incredibly unique pairing of Western and traditional Asian philosophical training and meditative training. He has become one of the most accomplished and premier translators on the planet. He has been the personal translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama for many, many years. He's translated many important works from Tibetan into English and has published many books as an author. It's just an incredibly impressive amount of work that he's done purely in the realm of translation, in addition to all of the training I mentioned earlier. He's also been involved in some of the most important organizations that are bridging the ancient wisdom of Tibet with the modern world. So, in addition to a lot of his work as a translator and the work he did with the Institute of Tibetan Classics, he has played a really important key role in the Mind and Life Institute. Many of you have probably heard of the Mind and Life Institute. This is the organization that has been bridging the world of scientific research and increasingly many other academic disciplines, but starting with the science and the meditative traditions of the world. And of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been centrally involved in that as well. So I could go on and on about all the organizational things he's been doing as well. The last thing I'll mention is that he is the founder and chairman of the Compassion Institute. And he, probably like me, one thing we share is I think we're probably both curriculum nerds. He is also the author of the Compassion Cultivation Training, which he designed when he was at Stanford as a scholar and researcher. So, Jimpala, it's just a tremendous honor to have you with us. We're going to be dialoguing about Abhidharma specifically in a very practical sense, but I just want to welcome you on behalf of Mingyur Rinpoche and the Tergar community. It's so great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for your warm words of introduction and thank you all for being part of this conversation. It's a real joy to have this opportunity, and I really look forward to our conversation. And it's particularly a joy to meet Mingyur Rinpoche's community, Tergar community. I've seen the Tergar idea at the beginning and evolve. And, Mingyur Rinpoche is an amazing teacher, amazing scholar, a real embodiment of what a spiritual mentor and teacher, in Tibetan we call Gewe Shenyin, like Kalyan Mitra. And he has really cultivated this community in a very, very beautiful way, offering both the practical teachings that are very beneficial in day-to-day life, as well as deeper engagement and delving into the insights and teachings of the Dharma. So I wanted to take the opportunity, first of all, to really express my gratitude and appreciation, and also say that I'm honored to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimpala. So I was thinking about how to kick this discussion off, and the topic is Buddhist psychology and habits in particular, what Buddhist psychology has to say about habits. We of course have this ancient road mapping of the mind and mental states that in traditional terms is called Abhidharma. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about your personal journey because you started at a very young age in learning all of these things that we're going to discuss today. And I think a lot of us who haven't been around the monastic world in particular, probably have some idealized notions that it must just be this very laid back, you're kind of hanging out and meditating all day. But I can imagine at Ganden, it's probably more like Harvard or Cambridge than it is some like relaxed,
Yes, true,
meditation
true.
place. I imagine it was super competitive. I imagine it was incredibly intense and rigorous from the point of view of the training. And you were just a young kid when you started there. I wonder if you could just talk about what that was actually like living in that intense but historically important environment.
Well, actually, my first kind of experience of monastic life began elsewhere at Dzongkhyéden Monastery, a much smaller monastery. And I was 11 when I first joined that monastery. And what the immediate kind of trigger for my wanting to become a monk was the visit of monks who came to the boarding school in Shimla. And, at the school, my abiding memory was that of boredom. There was really, I wasn't challenged at all. And
Mm,
when these monks came, each of the classes was assigned one. And the monk assigned to our class taught us basic debating techniques. And
mm.
I was completely blown over. And as a
And
10-year
how old were you? How old
I
were
was
you when
10
you
at the
were
time.
10? Okay,
So,
so just a little kid.
10-year-olds, just wanted to be like this monk.
Yeah, yeah.
So, at 11, I chose I had an opportunity to be in Dharamsala where my father was a monk at this monastery. And I did not know, of course, 10-year-old is not going to know whether one is an academic monastery or not. I ended up in this small monastery, which was not an academic, but eventually I made my way to Ganden about age 19. Ganden, as you pointed out, is, I mean, an interesting thing about these Tibetan monasteries, the academic monasteries are really like Harvard and, Cambridge and Oxford. It's the primary focus is really scholarship. And the scholarship is quite rigorous and it goes all the way back to Indian Nalanda tradition, where you have a combination of root texts in verses that are being memorized, then the commentaries, being read, and then there's a 1 hour class every day, and then you spend basically 4 to 5 hours every day in a debating courtyard. So, which is where the main learning platform is really through a dialogical debate from peer to peer, because teachers, only introduce you the topic and open up some questions, and much of the learning takes place in the debating courtyard. I really enjoyed it because I've got a sort of a more intellectual bent of mind, and that style really suited me. And the personal practice is really left to individuals to do their own daily sadhanas, because, as you know, Tibetan monastics, well, they may be studying philosophical text, but on a personal level, everybody is a Vajrayana practitioner, has received empowerments which require a certain daily sadhana practice. So you do the sadhana practice, and then we will have group, kind of chantings and prayers, but the bulk of the actual practice is really left at the individual, and the communal activity is really primarily this kind of rigorous scholarship. I really enjoyed it, that kind of balance. Yeah.
I'm curious that the shift from being in this boarding school to the first monastery and then from there to Ganden, it sounds like you were 19. I imagine one of the big things that shifted was you move from just kind of the life of a normal kid to this monastic atmosphere where self-discipline is a huge part of
Sure.
it. There's a very regimented
Sure.
daily
Sure.
routine. You're expected to maintain, all of the different aspects of a monastic life. And I'm curious if that was this kind of relates to our topic of habits. Was
It's true.
was did you just jump into that and was that easy for you? Did you go through this period of was it a challenging transition to adopt all those new habits? How did that actually go for you?
Actually, the good thing about the monastic life is that because the daily life there are structures. So, for example, like when I was at the first monastery, every morning we had a morning prayer session. And then young monks had to memorize a certain amount of text depending on your capacity. And then you spend that. And then in the evening, you have to report it back to a senior monk who's the tutor. And then there's an evening prayer. So it's a kind of a structured. At the monastic university like Ganden, even though there may be no daily prayers, um, but there is a morning debate and an evening debate, and the morning debate starts with kind of a 20 minutes of chanting and meditation, and the evening debate has about an hour long chanting and meditation. So that there's a structure there. I think the structure really kind of helps because when you leave it entirely to yourself, just like in the Western university, like folks said, that was the one big challenge in Cambridge. Cambridge, the bulk of the core of your study is a one-to-one tutorial with a professor. But
Mhm.
the rest of the time, even you don't need to turn up at lectures. So it's entirely left to your own devices. So that is the big, but in the monastery, it's the structure itself makes it easier. And I actually I found it really the balance between structure and enough space and time for yourself to figure out was a really good combination. I mean, this is one thing where looking back, I think there's a beautiful line in Abhidharma text by Vasubandhu when he's talking about when we want to tackle a particular problem that is more kind of enduring, like if you have a more craving nature or addictive nature or angry, temper or whatever, people's, personality differ. He says that for the beginners, between countering it directly versus creating a structure and ambience and environment so that you're not confronted with that challenge. He says the latter option is wiser for the
Mm.
beginners because, this is one of the reasons why in many spiritual traditions there are rituals. There are rituals and structures, and also, for example, like if you want to commit a daily meditation practice, just if you don't choose a particular space, create an ambiance like a small corner in the house or maybe a room, have a little altar or a flower. So you create that physical environment which kind of invites you to be in that state of mind. So I think I mean, once you're more advanced, I suppose I don't think you need any of these props, but having a structure, creating a kind of a ambiance and environment that actually facilitates that kind of quest that you have. And this is where I think the monastery is very well designed because they
Mm.
give you enough structure, but also enough freedom.
That's such an interesting point, and it reminds me of the years I spent living in Asia. So I was in mainly in Kathmandu for about 8 years, living in this area that I'm sure you know well, Jimpala, in Bodhanath. And so you're surrounded by monasteries. You're in this kind of historically kind of important Buddhist setting where you're just seeing things all the time that are just reminding you of practice. And I had this experience of going back and forth where I would be there most of the year, but then I would go home for a month or two, and then I would come back and forth. And I remember every time I went home, it was so much harder to stay interested and inspired in my practice. And I didn't really get it at the beginning. And I started to see that when I was home, I had nothing in my life. The context, the daily routines, the structure, everything you're talking about, it of course wasn't a monastic structure, but it was a set of routines and a set of things I was surrounded by that was supporting my practice. And to linking that up with this topic of habits, I think I've seen in my own life that we focus so much on the action. Like everything is just
True,
you either do this thing or
true,
you don't, when actually
true.
so much depends on the surrounding causes and conditions. So maybe we could dig into that a little bit. And before we get into the more, the geeky part of it, I'm curious about the latter part where you shift. So you shifted from the boarding school to your monastery. Then you went to Ganden with this, really intense, really regimented environment. Then you were in a more Western
Yes,
academic scene
Cambridge,
where it
yeah.
was maybe some
Cambridge.
structure, but not as structured. But then like now you're in Montreal and you have like probably zero other than what you've created yourself. You have maybe none of that. So I'm curious when you shifted yet again to even less structure, was that a relatively seamless transition, or did the self-discipline that you developed earlier on, were you able to carry that with you into these periods where you didn't have that structure? How has that played out in your life?
I think my time as a monk, especially at Ganden, really kind of instilled in me kind of a good appreciation of discipline and structure.
Mm.
So by the time I left monastery and became a lay person, began a family life, it was no longer an issue. Actually, it just came quite naturally, and the appreciation of the need for structure and routine was already there. So, and so I actually feel deeply grateful to having been a monk, to have
Mm.
really learned that discipline. And also, as a monk, you learn kind of the value of self-reliance, so that you don't blame everything on others. And you take responsibility. And the monks, monastics, even to in practical terms, you know, every monk learns how to cook. So take care of yourself. So I think I really feel deeply grateful to having had that experience of, kind of lived as a monk. And then later, I mean, this is one thing that I realized early on is that a key insight in Buddhist psychology is that if you are truly committed to some pursuit, say, for example, meditation practice, or whether you want to, deal with your anger issue, or whether you want to be more generous in your personality so that people around you benefit from this, or whether you want to kind of, whatever you want to do, I think initially, this is one area where everybody makes a kind of in the West, a kind of a commitment on the first day of the
Mm.
new year, right? But then they just fall away. But one key insight in Buddhist psychology is that the initial burst of embarking on a particular journey can occur as a result of exercising the power of your will.
Mhm.
But to sustain that over a long period of time, will alone is not adequate. And in
Mm.
fact, if you rely just on will, it's exhausting because exertional will requires effort, conscious effort. Whereas, so what is needed for the sustaining of that motivation is an element of joy.
Mm.
This is a key insight in Buddhism, and we actually, those who have been parents, will know. For example, when your children are small and you want them to pick up a sport or a musical instrument, at the beginning, it's hard work. You drive them to the practices. My younger daughter played sorry, not piano, violin. Piano at least makes good noise, but violin, if it is not played properly, it produces this really annoying sound all the time. But at some point, when your child masters it, begins to enjoy it, then there is intrinsic motivation,
Mm.
self-generating motivation. So this is what the Buddhist psychology is getting at. I think you need to find a way to have a joy, and joy does not mean in a pleasant or pleasure sense. It's in the sense of satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of accomplishment. So I
Mm.
think and often that sense of accomplishment and purpose, fulfillment really arises if you see a purpose. So this
Mm.
is one of the reasons in many Buddhist texts they extol the virtues of a particular pursuit. For example, Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva Way, which is a hugely influential text. The first chapter is all about extolling the virtues of bodhicitta. Like
Mm.
it's almost like a kind of a poetic eulogy of the greatness of this altruistic mind. And then that, when you have that kind of admiration, then you want to cultivate it. And anything that contributes towards that cultivation becomes purposeful. And when you see the purpose, and this is where contemporary psychology now links sense of purpose with happiness.
Yeah.
And Buddhist psychology has kind of understood that fairly early. So I think for those of us who want to continue to practice, especially, all of us, most of us don't have the luxury or the privilege to be part of a community in a monastic setting on a day-to-day basis. So then in that sense, our sense of community is more virtual, like the Tergar community is kind of virtual, but the onus is on you to create that space in your own home where you have that that association that you make, and the sense of joy and fulfillment that you bring. And
Mm.
that way, I think the kind of continuity of your practice does not become hard work that is effortful, having to exert your will all the time. It becomes a joyful. So I think this is where I think for those of us who are really committed to having a kind of a life of practice, we need to find that joy and structure and routine and this physical ambiance associated with the place where we sit.
So how do so you've mentioned a few really interesting and important points from Buddhist psychology and how to think about habits and doing new things. And I'm sure all of us can relate to having that spark of inspiration where you maybe you hear something from a friend or you read something or you listen to a podcast and you're like, "Oh, I want to do that." And you have that moment of inspiration. That of course doesn't last long. And if
True.
that's all that you're relying on, that's very fragile. And as you said, it's kind of like a finite resource. It's going to be gone pretty soon. And then we think, "Oh, it's just a matter of willpower," exactly as you point out. So going back to the first point, you had mentioned that Vasubandhu, who's one of the kind of the main architects of the Abhidharma tradition as we know it in Tibetan Buddhism, one of the points that you mentioned was structure,
Yes.
and how we can perhaps overlook that when it comes to building healthy habits or letting go of unhealthy habits. I'm curious, having had all this monastic training, and you said that because you developed that self-discipline and it was sort of in your wiring, so to speak, that when you got to Cambridge or you started a family, you were able to bring that with you. What, in a very practical sense, what are the specific things around this question of structure, though you think that those of us just living fast-paced lives with jobs and families, like how can we actually do that? What are some practical tips from the
Um,
tradition that maybe aren't only for monastics, but even we could use in our own lives?
well, I think, for example, I mean, I can give examples from my own life. So when we moved to Montreal, my daughter was about a year old and elder daughter. And so I said to my wife, I said, one of the things is that we should not have TV on the main floor where we have the kitchen and the living room.
Hmm.
TV should be in the basement. And the reason for that is that if you have it on the living in the on the main floor, then when you are kind of bored or tired, you just automatically, switch it on.
Mm,
So I
yeah.
have a lot of family members living in New York. They have their TV in the main room, and then everybody's talking, but the TV is in the background. So whereas when we chose not to have TV on the main floor, then if you want to watch something, it has to be more deliberate. You have to
Mm,
go downstairs to watch it in the basement. So those are simple structural adjustments, which makes a huge difference because if you have TV on the main floor, then you're relying heavily on your will not to switch it on.
yeah.
Okay. So that's a simple, I mean, a silly example, but it's a powerful one.
Yeah, you construct your
Yeah,
environment to
exactly.
support the habit
Yeah,
that you want to
exactly.
build or
Yeah,
to avoid a habit that you don't want to build.
exactly. And then I think, from the Tibetan tradition's point of view, one of the most important aspects of a kind of a spiritual practice is the morning intention setting.
Mm,
And the intention setting, so Kulon Choba, is a really key. Even though the idea is in there in Indian Mahayana Buddhism, but they never formalized this in the sense in which the Tibetans did it. Tibetan tradition kind of came up with this pairing of initial setting of your motivation with the evening concluding dedication and reviewing. And so that you structure your day in that, frame your day within these two kind of points. And the morning intention setting, I think at least finding 2 minutes in the morning to do that practice. And, if you have a formal sitting practice on a daily basis, you can do it right at the beginning. And
mhm, mhm.
Tibetans tend to do it with chanting of reaffirming, going for refuge in the three jewels, and then the reaffirmation of bodhicitta, the awakening mind. Or you can do it by simply chanting the four immeasurables, the four lines.
And is it in your, I mean, you've been doing this for decades, I imagine. Is it very scripted in your mind, or is it more of like an open-ended process where you're kind of thinking about things and yeah,
Well,
how scripted is it? Because of course the chanting part is very scripted, like you're
yeah, it
literally saying the
is.
same words.
But
But
my
yeah, what's
own
the inner
formal
process?
practice is fairly scripted. It's,
Hmm.
kind of basically sadhana. But then I do specify at the end of when I finish the session, a very specific intent. So you can choose that, for example, and even after the formal sitting, you could have a specific intention setting when you are working on a particular theme, or if you are dealing with a particular challenge, you can set aside a special setting of your intention for that. So I think the setting intention is really, really crucial because
Mm.
it's like setting the tone for the day.
And
So
if
what
somebody
I think,
doesn't have a script, like, if people are doing formal Tibetan Buddhist practice or in other
you
traditions,
don't
they
need to
might
have a
have.
script.
So
Yeah.
what would you say to somebody who's like, okay, I want to try that out tomorrow morning when I wake up? What could they do in the absence of having a formal liturgy?
I think the first step is to really take some deep breath to settle your mind because you
Mm,
cannot just will your attention. Okay, so this is one key insight from the Buddhist tradition that whatever serious practice you do, it always should begin with the relaxation. You kind of just grounding yourself, coming back to your body, and just feeling that energy of slowing down. Because otherwise, your your mind is always chasing after something. It's either chasing after the senses or it's chasing after contents of thought. I mean, that's basically what mind does. I mean, there was a big paper that pointed out that 50% of the time our mind is wandering. I mean, even
yeah.
if we're supposed to be focused on something, but that's the kind of nature of mind. We shouldn't really blame it. That's how the mind is very active. So even for brief intention setting, take few seconds of deep breath so that you feel the energy of slowing down and then you could actually, you don't need to do it on a daily basis. Once in a while, you should connect with your deeper aspiration. What are your deeper aspirations? Whether it's for happiness, whether it's for becoming a better person, whether we want to make a real difference in the world. So, what inspires you? What are the aspirations that inspire you? And then based connected with that, then you set your conscious intention. So for example, today I'm going to be more self-aware in my dealing with others.
Mm.
I'm going to bring consciously greater kindness. Um, I'm going to be less reactive. So whatever you can set, you know, I want to change the world is probably too big of an intention, which should be the underlying intention. But for intention settings to work, it probably helps to have a bit more achievable, specific content. And then you end your morning session. And so the good thing about intention is that when you make a conscious intention, it gives you an opportunity to bring that into your awareness when you are confronted with the situation.
Mm.
So that because intention and attention together is what leads to the ability to bring awareness. Because awareness is crucial in our everyday life. When we're able to bring awareness, then we're able to act consciously in a context based on our values and our intention. But when
Mm.
there is no awareness, we react. But awareness cannot be willed. It either shows up or it doesn't show up. But awareness is often a function of combination of intention and bringing attention in a given moment. So the intention setting is key. So that's, I think, a basic thing that people can do.
Mm. I, I've found that so helpful in my life, and even in very little ways, as you said, starting the day with something like that. But then even for short moments, as you're shifting between activities, for example, even right before we started this, we had a few minutes before we actually started, and I basically did what you said. I just paused for a minute. And those who know me will know well that when I started meditating 30 years ago, I had a ton of anxiety, and public speaking was at the top of my list. I was completely and utterly phobic of public speaking. So I would have a habit of getting very up in my head and fearful before something like this. And so for me, it helps in so many ways. But for example, with something like this, I paused for a moment and I just reminded myself of why am I doing this? And it's not for me. I'm doing this, so hopefully people can connect with this ancient tradition. They can learn from you. They can benefit in their lives. And just forming the aspiration to be of service and that this might be of benefit to everybody who hears this, to everybody who's listening now. And it's so interesting what happens in that space. It immediately short circuits the
True,
me part of it. Like, oh my
true,
God, am I going to say the right thing?
true.
That could spiral off into all sorts of anxious thinking or whatever your emotional habit is. And instead, it takes it more into this heart space of compassion and wanting to be of service. And that can be just 20 seconds. I mean, it's not
True,
like it has to be some huge long
true.
thing, but it changes the whole trajectory
Yes.
of the activity then you then do, whatever, however long that might be. It's kind of magical and it's not even hard to do. It's just a little habit you can pick up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this is actually one very practical thing that everybody can do. It really has a tremendous, for a small amount of time and effort, the payback is amazing. I mean, it's basically sets the tone. Um,
What I just had this thought. You've spent so much time with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You've been at his side for years, for decades. What do you think he would say if somebody asked him this ancient tradition, there's so much depth and richness. What's the most important thing? If somebody's going to focus on one thing in their life, we're talking about compassion now.
yes,
Anyways, maybe I don't want to.
yes, yes.
What do you think he would say? What's the one thing that people should do if they're going to just take one key point from this tradition and his teachings?
I think, I mean, he is a really a big believer in the power of connecting with your own compassionate nature, because
Mm,
as human beings, we are empathetic creatures. And His Holiness sometimes brings a kind of a more naturalistic, evolutionary kind of understanding in this, saying that as a social creature whose early survival is so dependent on someone else's care,
mm,
we have built in us a natural ability to appreciate kindness and compassion. So he believes that compassion is, if there is the one kind of one thing, he would say compassion. And in fact, last year, this was one of his last public engagements in English. There was a small group from Harvard that came to see him. I was there, and this was in March. And then before that, there was a group of young students, scholars from three different universities, the Dalai Lama fellows, uh,
mm,
so UVA and Stanford and University of Colorado, um, Boulder. So And there were questions and answers. And His Holiness at this age now, he's much less interested in getting into the details. And,
mm,
he's going to be turning 90 soon. And with the Harvard group, they pushed a bit once in a while. And in the end, I mean, he did respond to the specific questions, but he said one thing which really struck me. And I've heard this before, but this time he said it in a very powerful way. He said, this person was asking about the current state of humanity in the world,
mm,
all the polarizations and, sort of uh, unhelpful rhetoric that is crowding the space and all of this, and the conflicts, the ongoing conflicts in the world. His Holiness said that we human beings, so long as we don't forget where we come from, that we come from mothers,
mm.
and then our first experience was that of love, caregiving. He said, we'll be okay. The
Wow.
moment we
Such a simple
humans,
thing.
yeah, it's a very simple thing. The moment we humans forget that and move further away and away from appreciating that basic nature of who we are, social creatures, totally dependent on someone else's care, then he says we will have trouble. And I think, I mean, of course, when he was teaching, he would delve deeper. And one of the things that he often says is that the beautiful thing about compassion is that it's not a skill that you have to learn. It's there. You just have to tap into it and find a way to apply it in the context where you would normally not apply. And he seems to have this understanding that this is a part of our nature. If we allow, this is where I think a little bit of meditation is helpful because we have so many competing forces in us. And to connect with the beautiful one, so you do need to have that space, So he seems to, his belief is that if we find a way to connect with that, and then we will then be able to see others from that space where the primary perspective of another person will be rooted in a recognition of a shared human condition. That just like me, the other person doesn't want to suffer. Just like me, the other person wants to be happy. And that appreciation of shared humanity will allow your interaction to be shaped by it. And when you're able to do that, he says that in fact you also become stronger because once you have a feeling of connection, there's much less room for fear and anxiety. So I
Hmm.
think if there's one thing that if he's asked to choose, he will, in my mind, no doubt, say compassion.
And there's an interesting relationship between what you're sharing now and structure and because it's not, I mean, I think a lot of the way I grew up, you would hear something like this and you might be inspired or moved by it. But I don't think I learned anything early on in my
Mm,
upbringing that would teach me what to do with that. And so
true,
I have a lot of memories of reading a book or hearing something, especially early in life before I started to meditate, and feeling like I've understood something that's going to change my life. But a week later, a month later, a year later, actually my life's the same because I had nothing in my life
sure,
to nurture that. It
sure,
was
sure,
just a memory that I had an epiphany one day.
sure,
Whereas this is linking those moments of inspiration, you immediately almost translate that into a practice, into a ritual, and you have almost like something where it can land in your
exactly.
life, where
Yeah,
you have to nurture it. You have to be
sure,
intent, like you talked about intention, you talked about structure, like the idea of waking up in the morning and do something. So it's kind of the combination of all of these things rather than willpower alone and
true,
inspiration, which is intuitively what we think we
true,
need to do.
true, true.
Are there
And
other
also,
things, and from the
yeah.
point of view of Buddhist psychology, are there other kind of key elements of of the equation?
Well, I mean, with respect to, because here we are talking about formation of habits,
Hmm.
also changing habits. When it comes to mental development, it's not something that can take place overnight. I mean, even in relation to body, we know in the muscles building and all of this takes quite a long time, period of time, because
Yeah.
they're kind of cumulative. And in the case of mind, it's even more. And also, we have to understand, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, we would say that, because of belief in rebirth, we have been habituated with all the afflictions like attachment and anger and jealousy and all of this over successive, many multiple lifetimes. So we have accumulated power of the habits that have been formed. So doing a Dharma practice is like trying to go upstream, beginning to undo that. So there, I think, right from the beginning, kind of the Dharma practitioners should have a kind of a sober recognition that it's going to take time
Hmm.
and it needs to be that your practice needs to be consistent. Uh, but also, I think as part of the enthusiasm, maintenance of your enthusiasm, you do need to see small progresses along the way, because otherwise you get discouraged. And also, if you recognize that certain things, for example, like paying attention to your breath, at the beginning can be tough, because you're doing something that you normally don't do unless, we pay attention to our breath when there's a problem. Normally. Otherwise, we just take it for granted. The breathing happens on its own. But when we consciously pay attention to the breath and rest our mind on it, it's not easy, to over a system to do it for a prolonged period of time. Do it for 1 or 2 seconds is not an issue. And so when you do that, but over time, it becomes kind of effortless. And the same thing with this is where the intention setting is a beautiful practice because when you do it on a regular basis, then it becomes a habit. And then because you're setting the tone, it tends to steer your mind towards a particular way of doing things. And cumulatively, all of a sudden, you will see you're a changed person. So I think you will have a different, relationship. So for example, like, you know, um, say bodhicitta, okay, the awakening mind, if you deeply admire, or say universal compassion, you deeply admire the ideal. But unless you do the practice, cultivation practice yourself, you wouldn't have that experiential taste of what it means. And once you begin to have that, even when you read about it, you have a different relationship with what you're reading.
Hmm.
So those are, kind of cumulative effects. And I think for changing the mental habits, I think not over relying on your will, having a structure, putting more energy at the intention level, making sure that you genuinely have a deep admiration for the particular practice, the pursuit, that you see a sense of purpose and there is an element of joy. And then and over time, you will see that expressed in your daily behavior. You will conduct yourself in a different way. Things that used to make you freak out no longer seem to freak out that much. Even when you do freak out, sometimes we do need to freak out because if there's a threat, we do need to freak out, but then you are able to return to your baseline much faster. So those are fruits of practice because Buddhism, of course, speaks about the ability, the potential to totally root out all of these destructive emotions. But for ordinary people, purely from a secular perspective, that seems to be a tall order. But on the other hand, we do know from personal experience that things that used to bother you so much, for example, like rumination, and when something happens, being stuck in that thought without being able to return to a baseline of kind of tranquility, those things do change. People become much less reactive. Even when they react, that reaction tends to last shorter, and you're able to maintain your composure and return to your base much faster. So those are powerful kind of, benefits of practice. Of course, for a Dharma practitioner, especially Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, the aim is to have realization of emptiness, bodhicitta, and all of this. But those are kind of downstream. But in the process, while you are on the path, there's so many benefits that you can reap, and because the underlying motivation is altruistic, because you want to be there with your optimal potential to be of benefit to others. Because
Hmm.
the Tibetan Buddhism being Mahayana Buddhism, a key animating idea is really compassion.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of, there's the beautiful line in Shantideva where he says that the enlightened Buddhas have contemplated for eons, and they have come to find that this alone is the most beneficial thing to do. I mean, they're talking about altruistic activity and altruistic intention.
Hmm.
And so for Tibetan Buddhists who are truly animated by that ideal, then when you become a better person, kinder person, then the work of, helping someone else becomes more natural, effortless. And you see, so it's not just for yourself. I mean, yes, there is a whole movement in the West for self-improvement, self-cultivation, and all the rest, which is fine. But in the Buddhist context, all of this self-cultivation is not done just for yourself.
Yeah.
It's done for a higher purpose, which is to allow your natural compassion to become more universal, to really, kind of emulate the examples of the great Bodhisattva, and to really seek meaning in the context of being of benefit to someone else. So I think, and there, I think having intention, this ideal that is a source of inspiration, and then a daily practice, and then making sure that every now and then in your day-to-day action, that you do reflect, you do bring it back so that there is a kind of a reinforcement. And that's the way in which I think we can change habits. Yeah.
With that last point, you mentioned reflection, and there's a lot, of course, in the Buddhist tradition about self-reflection, about a kind of a very healthy process where you look back, it could be on a day or your life more broadly, and you're just seeing, what's playing a wholesome role in my life, what's not playing a wholesome role, and
Sure.
bringing a lot of intention to that. I think in the modern world, one of the things that is so common these days is rumination and
Yeah,
self-reflection that is not healthy,
true,
self-reflection that's filled with a kind of toxic
true,
self-judgment. And I
true,
think so many people struggle with that. And if we think about self-reflection as a very large category, from toxic rumination on the
true,
one hand to on the other side is maybe a very healthy, curious self-inquiry that's
true,
more driven by curiosity than
true.
self-judgment. How can somebody actually do that? If you imagine you're somebody saying, okay, it's the end of the day, they're just about to go to bed and they want to take a few moments to do that, but in a healthy way, what is a way that they could do that that doesn't slip into the more toxic
True.
rumination side of things?
That's a really, really, really good point. Actually, the key difference between a healthy self-reflection and rumination is the rumination is it's undisciplined.
Hmm.
It's basically
Just happening
it
automatically.
just
You're not
happens
trying to do it.
automatically, and it's kind of a habitual thought pattern. And interesting thing about rumination is that it's almost always about yourself. It's a kind of a self story that you're telling. Whereas self-reflection is a more disciplined application of that. And
Hmm.
this is where I think intention setting is key, because intention setting is the kind of the I don't know what you can call it. It's like a kind of the first boundary that you set, which becomes a point of reference. So whatever the content of your intention setting is the thing that you need to bring into the self-reflection. So for example, if you are dealing with your anger issue, so
Hmm.
you're setting your intention to make sure that you pay more attention in situation, bring more awareness, be less reactive, and take the time when someone provokes you instead of just reacting, remembering to breathe. So those are part of the intention. The reflection would then be at the end of the day. So, for example, if you're doing this for a period of 2 weeks, you choose 2 weeks to focus on your dealing with your anger issue, and then you want to see whether it has made any difference. So during that period, in addition to the other intention, general intention settings that you do, but you set a specific intention on dealing with your anger. So at the end of the day, every evening, briefly for 2 minutes or something, you review the day, because you're going to have, nobody lives unless you are living a hermit life in a forest, as in the wilderness, like some great meditators do, but most of us live in the context of interaction with others. And so you briefly review to see, and where what happened during the day, and then take joy where you have made a small progress,
Hmm.
and then where you did not succeed, then acknowledge it. Don't beat yourself. And that acknowledgement and recognition will help you motivate further to improve. And that you can do that in 2 or 3 minutes, maybe even in a minute. And that's a kind of a healthy self-reflection. It's like almost like a reviewing. But in order for that to be effective, the ideal scenario is, for example, when you happen to have a difficult conversation with someone, and often it's the context of more intimate relationships like family members where, conversations get heated and you feel kind of defensive and you lash out. So when things like that happen, it's helpful then to take a time soon after to quickly reflect, so that your experience, and you don't want to be completely controlling yourself, because then if you do excessive control, then you're suppressing your
Hmm.
emotion. You need to have a healthy relationship with your emotion. Suppression is one form of experience, extreme. The other one is a completely unbridled explosion. That's another extreme. So as a practitioner who's interested in developing healthy habits of the mind, you need to find that sweet spot in the middle. And there, I think initially, you are going to get explored if you have that temper kind of, personality. But if you choose to, after the event is over, you're alone, you quickly review, why did I do that? What was the trigger? And then you begin to recognize what the triggers are. This is where the awareness and becomes a key
Hmm.
because often we don't know what our triggers are, and triggers are different for different people. And then of course, you know, and individuals also differ on values. Everybody has good values, but within the values, some people take integrity as being very important, or sense of fairness, or, and being kind. And if someone accuses of you of something that challenges your self-image as a kind person, you react badly,
Yeah, right,
So,
right.
so those are different triggers. And so one thing that happens with an intention setting and reviewing is that you begin to know yourself better. This is where self-awareness is a crucial factor. And the self-awareness will get improved if you have this self-reflection, because self-reflection is like revisiting the event and finding ways in which it could have been reframed. So you can imagine a scenario where you could have acted in a different way. Still, that would have been effective. So that's what I mean by self-reflection. So the key difference is rumination is undisciplined. It just happens. And often it's really about yourself. Whereas conscious self-reflection is a more disciplined approach, application of mind. Yeah.
Well, yeah, one of the threads that I'm seeing through all the different pieces that you're talking about here is practice, that we see
Yeah.
these things as conscious, intentional practices, whether it's self-reflection or setting an altruistic, compassionate motivation. And again, I think that's something that a lot of us don't necessarily think about our lives in quite that same way. We tend to think about ourselves as we either are this way or we're not. We have these
Yeah.
qualities or we don't.
Sure.
And
Sure.
if something happens, we're inspired one time or we're not.
True.
It just sort of happens. We don't necessarily think, oh, like that happened because of these causes and conditions. And if I intentionally create my life to have those causes and conditions again, I'm going to have that experience again. So how
True.
do I consciously do that? And when it comes to self-reflection, I don't think I was necessarily doing it in a very structured way, but I remember when I was first starting to meditate, one of the first things that I realized was that for the first maybe 6 months or so, I was very on again, off again. I would practice for a few days and then I wouldn't. And I would practice for a few days and I wouldn't. And it was very inconsistent and it was helpful. I knew there was something beneficial, but it wasn't, I wouldn't, the inspiration faded very quickly. But at a certain point, I asked myself, or I looked and I tried to see why is it that I'm doing it sometimes and I'm not doing it other times. And I realized it was one very simple thing. Every time I started meditating again, I had read something. I had picked up a book and I read something that got me interested. And that when I stopped meditating, I hadn't been reading anything.
Ah, okay.
And that one insight was huge because I realized, oh, yeah, if like you said earlier, the inspiration doesn't really last very long. So you can't read something one day
True.
and expect
True.
that 2 months later
It's
you're going
true.
to have a consistent level of inspiration. But if I translate that into my life now, if I wake up in the morning and say I do my morning routine and I immediately turn on, like listen to a CNN podcast or something like that, I know that that is going to lead me down a path
True.
where I'll have trouble getting back to my daily meditation practice. But if I read something or I listen to something that sparks that interest, I know the meditation will be automatic. I'll want to do it. So it's more about the conditions I create in my life than just the willpower of doing the
That's
thing.
true.
But all of that came from what you're talking about. It was just a little self-reflection, like, huh,
Yeah.
not like beating myself up because I didn't do it, but oh, that's interesting. Why am I doing it here and not doing it there? What's going on? And you just kind of
True.
look and then you learn. You actually learn how
True.
your mind is working.
True. 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 Yeah. That's a beautiful example, actually. It's very powerful. Yeah. Once you catch that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had none of the other things that people normally have that support a meditative life. Like I didn't have a community. Nobody I knew meditated. This is in the early 90s. So where I lived, it was like I had a friend who accused me of joining a cult. He's like, "Oh, are you in a cult?" And I'm like, I'm just watching my breath. It's not." But so
Mm.
yeah, for me it was all books. I'm curious, so we've talked a lot about the positive side of building habits, like positive habits that we want to do. I'm curious what Buddhist psychology has to say in your own personal experience with bad habits, with things that aren't wholesome. What does Buddhist psychology have to say about what keeps bad habits spinning? What are the maybe just to understand from a Buddhist psychological point of view, what is the architecture of those habits? Even though it's creating suffering in our lives, we don't like it, but yet it somehow has this compulsive energy. What does Buddhist psychology say about that in a way that might help us deal with it in a more healthy way?
Well, I think the key insight in Buddhism is really kind of understanding the nature of these emotions. They're very powerful. Um, whether it is desire, or attachment, or anger, or jealousy, or kind of, this craving, or kind of a urge for gratification. So all of these are very, very powerful drives. And they have, and one of the things about them is that they are quite immediate and their effect is felt very powerfully. I mean, a lot of them make you feel alive. I mean, that's for sure.
Hmm.
That's the power of emotions. And so there's a kind of an addictive side to them, which, you know, um, kind of makes us feel that somehow we're energized, we're alive. And then then they tend to lead to destructive behavior, but then that we worry later. So, so we're kind of
Right.
more,
Exactly.
we
We
get
get all
caught.
bent out of shape a day later or a week
Exactly,
later,
yeah.
not when it's happening.
So
Yeah.
we get caught in that experience, which is so alive. I think this is probably one of the main reasons. So in say, for example, like in Abhidharma text and others, there's a lot of focus, on understanding the mechanics of how these powerful emotions arise. There's for example, talking about what triggers, what objects give rise to them. Um, what is the personality type of people who are more susceptible to this or that type of powerful emotions? So there's a whole kind of discussion which is quite detailed, actually. I mean, there's a, even the Kadamba masters, they're well known for saying that as a Dharma practitioner, one of the most important tasks is to stand guard at the door of your senses
Hmm.
so that you don't allow your senses to dictate, your life, your thoughts, and guard against the afflictions, the powerful afflictions when they arise, so that you distance yourself. So there is this idea that a large part of that is really being able to bring self-awareness into these aspects of our thought, mental life, particularly the emotions, which are so powerful. Because emotions, when they arise, there's not much you can do. I mean, suppression is not advised, but you can actually, one of the aims in Buddhist mental training is to uh, predispose yourself in such a way that you are less susceptible to these explosive emotions that arise.
Hmm.
So I
And
think
and
it's
how do you
sort of
do that? How do you predispose yourself?
I think it's kind of, first step is to recognize the destructive power of these afflictions
Hmm. So
and
actually reflect on it to
to
kind of
reflect on them. So
review and
that's,
yeah.
yeah, that's a big thing. For example, like in Shantideva's text, he talks about, the frustration being the fuel, frustration underpinned by dissatisfaction being the fuel for anger.
Hmm.
He says that if you are dealing with anger issue, you want to starve anger of its fuel, which means your approach should be kind of more upstream in exploring what things make you dissatisfied and frustrated, and so that you are much less vulnerable to anger. So I think there is that kind of bringing awareness into. So in contemporary psychology, we will talk about recognizing your own triggers. So if you are able to recognize what triggers you, then you are able to bring in, and if you're able to bring awareness. So the the idea here is to, in a sense, move backwards. So you have initial trigger. So of course, there's the underlying personality. So people differ, in terms of temperament. So there's the underlying personality, which is a broader condition. And there's the trigger, and there's the initial reaction, which is when the emotion is festering. And then the actual explosion of the emotion, arising of the emotion, and then the physical and verbal expression of it in the form of a behavior. So initially the task is even though everything happens fast, there is a sequence. So the aim of the practitioner is to start decoupling. So you have between the physical and verbal expression of the emotion to the actual experience of the emotion, there is an opportunity to put a kind of a divide.
So
So
you
that,
notice your emotional
yeah,
reaction before you say something or do something.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So this is one area. Then there is another space between the actual arising of the full emotion and the initial frustration or the festering of something, arising of the kind of impulse. So there again, there is a space. And then there is the space between the trigger, noticing the trigger, and the reaction that is discomfort, and uncomfortable reaction to this. So the aim is to start decoupling so that you then get to a point where even the triggers, which normally would have freaked you out, no longer seems to have that power. And that is the training of mind. And the key part of that is awareness. Because if you're not able to bring awareness into these moments, there's just no chance. You may know all the scriptures, you may know
Right.
recite the
But you
whole
can't
entire
apply it in the
Abhidharma,
moment. Yeah. Yeah.
but if you're not able to bring awareness, and the awareness is really a function of paying attention and having the intention and practice.
It's so funny. This brings back so many memories. My experience with anxiety, it was exactly what you said. The first thing that happened is that I was doing this very simple practice of breath awareness that you mentioned, and many people start with. And I didn't know anything about, altruistic intention. Like I learned that many years later in my practice. So I had a very simple meditation practice. It was very bare bones. But because I was used to paying attention to my breath when I was meditating, when I was out in the world just living my life and I would get anxious, which was the challenge I was having at the time. The first thing I noticed was that my breathing changed because I had been training myself to pay attention to my breath.
Yes,
That actually became almost like a positive trigger where I could see, oh, my breathing, it felt tight. Like my breathing there was sort of a tightness and it would be a little bit more rapid. So simply noticing that would short circuit the whole thing. And from there, it gave me more space where I could start to see, oh, what was it that triggered this response in the first place? And it almost as though the whole thing became kind of interesting at a certain point. It
yes,
wasn't overnight, but
sure.
it's what before was this source of great suffering in my life first became interesting, and then it almost became meaningful because I started to see it was almost triggering self-awareness because there was so much intensity to the experience. I really wanted to explore that from a certain point of view. And it opened so many doors in my own mind
Yes,
and emotions just by paying attention to how that all played out. But it's exactly what you're saying. It was almost injecting awareness into these little
exactly.
points in the
Yeah,
causal flow of experience.
exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, most people when they are not exposed to the Dharma, and then we tend to take things normal, and that's the way it is. There's nothing you can do about it, kind of thing. And also one of the beautiful things about Buddhist approach is that there is a kind of a very deconstructive element of Buddhism,
Mhm.
reductionist in some ways, because one of the things that Buddhism tells us is that a large part of our reaction to the world and the events in our life is based on a certain grasping
Mhm.
to an image of reality. And that image of reality is simplistic. And in fact, in Abhidharma language, they call that holding on to a unitary notion of things and things
Hmm.
as lumps, like rilbu,
Yeah,
like
Tergar students will know this well. Mingyur Rinpoche talks about that all the time. But
yes.
please dig into, yeah, if you could maybe unpack that a little bit for people who
So
might not be familiar.
for example, this idea of a lump, just putting everything into one thing and seeing things as one thing is considered to be a big problem because then you latch onto it, you have something concrete and solid, and you grasp onto it.
So for example, like in my example, I remember having this idea of I'm just an anxious person. But I remember when I looked what even is anxiety? I had this term anxiety, and that was almost like a mask for so much complexity.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah,
like as soon
exactly.
as I looked, I'm like, there's so many things going on, and I somehow lump all of that together and just call it anxiety. But the label
Exactly.
itself was almost blinding me to the richness of
So
the experience.
that's a powerful insight. I mean, that's the point Abhidharma is trying to raise. So, for example, like Abhidharma is very famous for coming up with the schema of the five aggregates.
Hmm.
The body and feelings, perception, and conditioning factors and consciousness. And the idea is to kind of move us further away from having this solid notion of a self, of a one
Hmm.
thing. But actually, self, as we imagine, conceived, is composed of these five different aggregates. And then each of these aggregates are further dissected. So I think one of the key insights of Abhidharma is to really point to us that whenever you have kind of a strong emotional reactivity issue, just question the assumption underlying that emotional reactivity. There is an image of a reality, an assumption of a reality. And when you question that, unpack it, it has a diffusing effect on your reactivity because the emotions, strong emotional reactions require some kind of assumption of a solidity of the object that we are
Hmm.
reacting to. So, so and so is a bad person. She doesn't like me. He's always unfair to me. Whatever it is, there's a kind of an image of reality that we get fixated on, which then offers that foundation on which to build all of our emotional reactivity. So I think this is where I think awareness and then a little bit of this is the role of wisdom. In fact, Abhidharma um, is closely connected with wisdom. So those who are familiar with Buddhism will know that on the level of practice, Buddhism speaks of threefold training: the
Hmm.
foundation, which is morality, um, meditative concentration, which is the ability to calm and quieten your mind so that you can make your mind your ally, and then wisdom is the actual content of the meditative state, which then allows us to free ourselves. So Abhidharma is connected with wisdom. So therefore, Abhidharma has really, even though Abhidharma on the surface tends to look very systematic list of things, but there is a purpose behind this systematic organizations of list, which is to really deconstruct, many ideas of solidity, and it's tied to this role of a wisdom which helps us cut through our perception. So I think if one thing that people can go away with in their understanding of what Abhidharma is, I think association of Abhidharma with the wisdom aspect of the threefold training is really the key. It's really, even from an evolutionary point of view of Abhidharma in the Buddhist tradition, there is a debate whether there's a specific set of teachings Buddha gave that can be called Abhidharma, or whether Abhidharma was extracted from the discourses and that those teachings that pertain more to the actual cultivation of wisdom. There's a debate, but in any case, the tradition, Buddhist tradition as a whole, recognize that wisdom is Abhidharma is where you learn about wisdom.
That's so helpful. We've got a lot of great questions. Some of them are very much on the points we're discussing. One person asked a really interesting question. This person wrote, "Why do I keep getting stuck in repetitive problem patterns, even though I'm aware of the reality? I keep getting stuck in these repetitive thoughts." So that raises an interesting question. Sometimes you can almost know that it's not real or that your mind is locked in some distorted way of seeing things, and yet the pattern continues, the compulsive energy of it continues. What does Buddhist psychology have to say about that, and how can we work with that, probably more importantly?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, one thing that we have to know is that just because you are aware and you know that it's going to immediately change, that doesn't really work.
Yeah, I mean, you can know
Yeah,
smoking is bad, but
it's
that doesn't
bad.
mean
Yeah,
like just
exactly.
knowing that you immediately quit
Yeah,
smoking. If
I mean,
that if
there
it
is a
was,
long
I wish it was
tradition.
that easy. That would make
Yes,
things a lot
there's a
easier.
long tradition in both East and Western philosophy that knowledge is the key to liberation and freedom, which is true. But knowledge an instance of knowledge is not really what they meant. Their
Mm,
knowledge internalized and made into an experiential kind of knowledge is what liberates us. So when you have, I mean, the fact that you're able to bring awareness is a massive step. Okay, that is a huge achievement. And once you are able to bring awareness, then it's helpful to not just move on, stay in that state, create a spacious mind where you really allow this awareness of the paradox of knowing the habitual kind of thought patterns that are unhealthy, but at the same time catching yourself doing it. This paradox of you doing it, create a space where you actually hold this.
mm,
That I think is a very important point because people sometimes, once they come to a realization, they just move on. So I think just having that so that you will, you talked about curiosity. So it's a way of bringing curiosity to this phenomenon where there's a kind of a paradox. And then habits, simply undoing habits is not adequate. You need to rebuild and you have to replace it with another kind of habit. So if it is a particular pattern in relation to an interaction with the person or in relation to certain activity in your life or whatever it is, if that is the habit that you are bringing, you need to replace it with a healthier one. Just undoing a habit, it's not going to work.
mm,
So you need to replace it. So it's a kind of a reframing. So it may involve, cognitive reframing so that your qualitative relationship with that changes. But I think so. My suggestion would be two things. One is to create space during a spacious mind meditation type, where you hold that contradiction, perceived contradiction, and the paradox, and stay with it so that you are actually comfortable staying with that, and then gradually finding a way to replace that pattern with
mm.
another one that is healthier.
That's very helpful. And what do you do with blind spots? That's another question. The person didn't use the term blind spot, but I think it's related to that. They talked about recognizing triggers that are unconscious.
Sure,
And that's also a really challenging one. I know from firsthand experience, for example, at work, it's like there's maybe something you're not seeing, but it's the very fact that you don't see it clearly. It's maybe not natural to see it
sure,
clearly
sure,
is what makes it so, even if you have the intention to want to work with it or to want to avoid something that's creating problems in your life, but the very fact that it's a blind spot means that you can't see it clearly. If it
sure.
weren't the case, you obviously would see it and you could work with it. So is there any suggestions for how to work with unconscious triggers or blind
I
spots
think,
like
I
that?
mean, as ordinary human beings, every one of us is going to have some form of blind spots. So, and this is one area where Buddhism's emphasis on insight and wisdom is really crucial, understanding. And with relation to blind spots, I think one of the important responses on your part is when you catch yourself to bring self-kindness. Because if you bring self-harshness, then it's not going to help. So that I think is an important point. And bring in a kind of element of humility because human beings are, I mean, if we expect perfect human beings, we are in for a real surprise. So, imperfection is part of who we are. That's what makes us very interesting. And blind spots are always going to be there for all of us. But I think just being the fact that you're more conscious and when you get caught of, this blind spot, then taking the time to pay attention to that and expanding your awareness and insight is really the way to go. But and then making sure that you don't self-judge in a negative way. Because the problem with the negative self-judgment is that it creates an aversive experience.
Mm,
Then we don't want to go there. So then you start locking yourself from greater awareness of your own state of mind. Because nobody likes aversive experience. So the negative self-judgment brings aversion. It's not so much that of course in contemporary psychology they speak a lot about self-compassion and all the rest, but from the Buddhist practitioner's point of view, the key problem with the lack of self-kindness is that it creates this aversive reaction, which then blocks a lot of progress down the line.
Mm. That's really insightful. I'm seeing that actually there's a number of questions that have to do with the intensity of the current social and political environment. And I think this is in many countries around the world are experiencing different versions of this. Here in the US, of course, it's a very intense time. And in some cases, it's just the uncertainty. People are talking about all the uncertainty that this is creating. And in some cases, it's very specifically around how different groups are being targeted. So I'm just going to read one comment, but this is kind of a theme of a number of different questions. So this person writes, I'm currently living in the US and I'm in the LGBTQ community, which is under attack. I'm experiencing a lot of panic that makes it hard to concentrate and feel okay. And then other times I'm fine. How can I help myself to feel more balanced?
Thank you for the question. This is really a very, very painful time right now, a time of huge uncertainty and fear, particularly for the community. I think on your part, you know, being more conscious in making sure of your safety and as much as possible, creating structures in your thought, in your life, where you can really kind of um, maintain your own sense of self-dignity, I think is crucial because um, the environment, changing the environment is always a much bigger challenge. And for whatever reason, the society, particularly in the West, in the US in particular, seems to be moving in a direction where there's a much higher level of intolerance of differences is happening. And that is a reality. And to what extent it's part of a pendulum swing and a birthing pain of a major social change, we don't really know. But whatever it is, the reality is there, and being more prepared. And then and this is one place where you can really benefit from Dharma. Dharma really kind of teaches you the skills to maintain some degree of your composure and sort of deal with uh, sort of any dangers that you might lead to self-doubting, because you need to have a sense of certainty in your own person. And this is one area where Dharma can really, really help. And then learning techniques, particularly from the Lojong, Buddhist mind training teachings, where there are specific practices that deal with how to deal with difficult adverse situations, and maintaining your compassion and kind of recognition of humanity, even of those who are creating so much problem. I think so. In that way, I think what you're doing is you're choosing a magnanimity on your part, but at the same time being very clear-eyed about reality. Um, so I think, I mean, right now it is, all of a sudden, I mean, there was a time when the world was looking more enlightened. I remember, and I'm old enough to know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Tiananmen Square, and massive democratic kind of popular uprisings, non-violent uprisings in different parts of the world that led to transformation of countries into democratic systems. There was a genuine optimism that we humans as a species was moving in a more enlightened direction, where there was a recognition of interconnectedness of our interest and well-being. There was a call for collective responsibility. There was a genuine optimism, but all of a sudden now we are in a different world. I mean, that's a reality. And so I don't know. I mean, it's for me, I also find it very difficult to when I think about the world outside and directions we are going. So I don't have any particular suggestion, but other than digging deeper into the Dharma resources, so that at least you are sure about yourself.
Mm,
Once you're sure about yourself, then you're in a better position to handle the situation around you.
mm. That's beautiful. There are so many good questions. I wish we had an entire day to spend with you. What you're sharing is so insightful, and there's so many great questions. But unfortunately, we're almost at the end of our time together. I wonder if I could just um, ask you to share what you think, you've lived such an amazing life from monasteries in the Tibetan community to having, a family and doing so many things in the kind of the fast-paced world that most of us live in. You've kind of, lived in all of these different environments, and you've gone so deeply into the Dharma and have been so fortunate to spend time with great masters, especially, of course, His Holiness. What do you think, again, if kind of like I asked you about what His Holiness would say, what would you say? Like what is the one thing that no matter how busy we are, what could we do in our daily lives to really help just be our very best as human beings in these challenging times? What's a simple thing that we could all leave with that you found in your own life has been really meaningful and helpful in a practical way?
Well, I mean, I am a huge admirer of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition's kind of elevation of compassion as the key virtue.
Mm,
Like, every single Tibetan chants the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra, which is the mantra of Buddha compassion. And, so there's a kind of a elevation of compassion as the key value. And, at least trying to live that value in whatever small ways one can. I find that to be probably the most powerful, thing that we can do on a daily basis. Of course, we can go into deep into compassion cultivation meditation, based on Shantideva's text and, culminating in bodhicitta and all the rest. But on a day-to-day level, the simple choice to look at world primarily from the place of shared humanity and trying um, to bring out kindness as a key modality of your interaction with the world. And the beautiful thing about kindness is that kindness presupposes understanding, so that you have a much greater capacity for tolerance of others' weaknesses, your own weaknesses, and sort of bringing a kind of an attitude of humility, but also a kind of a recognition of humanity, of self and others. I find that really, because in the end, no matter how complicated another person is that you're dealing with, at the core, we're exactly the same. I mean, that is a very simple idea, but on the other hand, it is a very powerful idea. You know, His Holiness often says that when he's in a new place, he says, I don't think I feel I need a formal introduction because I know exactly at a fundamental level what you feel, what you think. He says, just like me, you want to be happy. Just like me, you don't want to suffer. I think that's a simple idea, but it's a powerful one. And just being able to recognize that and bring that as much as possible in your interaction with someone else in your life, I find that to be truly powerful. Of course, in my own personal practice and study, I do quite a lot of more advanced level, things, especially in my work. But when the push comes to the shove, on a day-to-day level, living a family life, and having chosen to live a layperson's life in this Western world, the most powerful thing that I find is really this choosing kindness to be a key modality and valuing awareness as another value that I bring in. So if I think those two, I really find there's a kind of a beautiful thing about compassion is there's a kind of a simplicity to it. It really clarifies a lot of things because when you start asking questions about the morality of this and what is the most ethical thing to do here and all the rest, you can keep on debating about pros and cons and conflicts of values and all the rest. But there's nothing more clarifying like saying, okay, what is the most kind thing to do here? What is the most compassionate thing to do here? I find that to be powerfully clarifying, because as mortal human beings, unenlightened beings, we are never going to have a full knowledge of the world. This is where Buddhism says causes and conditions. If you trace causes and conditions can go very far. There's simply nowhere unless you are fully enlightened. But where you do have a say is your conscious state of mind, the intention that you bring, and then the attention that you pay. Because attention is a resource. The fact that you choose to pay attention says something about that you care. So I think these are two areas where intention and attention is two areas where we can make a difference. And I don't worry too much about whether what I said was the right thing or wrong thing, or, I can never fully know, okay, when it comes to the actual expression and action. You can never fully know whether that was the wisest thing to do. But you do have a say in so far as your own intention and attention is concerned. And so this is the area where I pay more attention, more focus, and I don't worry too much. I mean, that's one of the things that I tell my two girls is that my secret of happiness is having a healthy relationship with worrying. I don't worry too early.
That's great. Wow, this has been such a rich 90 minutes and such a great note to end on this note of making compassion the guiding force in our lives and surrounding that with awareness and intention. So on behalf of Mingyur Rinpoche and the Tergar community, we're so grateful that you took a time out of your busy life, not only for this morning, but really for all the work you've done, as a translator, as a teacher, as an author. I think so many of us have benefited from all the many, many things you've done throughout your life. So I just wanted to end on a note of gratitude for a life well lived and the fact that you've shared so generously with the Tergar community and with the world. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Jimpala.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
And for those of you watching, we've got, I think Jenny's going to pop back on here. We've got a few announcements. Of course, we're in the middle of this whole year spent exploring exactly these teachings, Mingyur Rinpoche's teachings on Buddhist psychology and the Abhidharma, and this rich, rich ancient tradition that Jimpala has been sharing with us. So, Jenny, I think you're going to share a little bit and lead us out of our event this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Court. Thank you, everybody behind the scenes, for helping to make this happen. And Jinpa, thank you so much for being here on behalf of everybody. So, yeah, as Court said, I've got some Tergar news for everybody. So, I think Fabio's going to share some slides. And if you stay around, especially if you're curious to know more about the Buddhist psychology, Abhidharma teachings, then here we are. So this webinar that we've been attending with Jinpa La is part of the Buddhist psychology transmission. And Mingyur Rinpoche has been collecting the different meditation practices throughout the Abhidharma literature, and he's compiled them to create a meditation manual for modern day practitioners. So in the Buddhist Psychology Immersion course, we've just begun practicing meditations from Rinpoche's new manual, Stainless Prajna, and the course is going to run until July, with new modules being released every month, so you can explore those at your own pace. So next slide, yeah. So today we've released new lessons on Vipassana meditation, which feature Mingyur Rinpoche's wonderful teachings and instructions how to practice with the four elements, so earth, water, fire, and wind in the body. The immersions include over 40 exclusive video teachings from Mingyur Rinpoche, covering all chapters of Stainless Prajna, more than 40 guided meditations and practices for daily life. There's live sessions and one-to-one interviews with Vajrayana online guides, and there's access to a draft translation of Rinpoche's new meditation manual, Stainless Prajna. And as a member of the Vajrayana online community, you'll get access to more than 25 courses, weekly live sessions, and you can learn more at vajrayana.tergar.org, and the link is in the chat for now. Final slide. And so we're also so excited to invite you to our community for the Buddhist Psychology Practicing Abhidharma retreat with Lama Trinley and Tergar guides, who guides, and they'll be leading us through the practices from Steina's Prajna. And this online retreat is accessible to everyone, so you don't need to have had any prior experience with Buddhism. It's happening next weekend, so February the 21st to 23rd, and you can register now, and the link is in the chat. So that's it from news from Tergar, and again, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you.
Please come back and teach us more.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Cortland, for really guiding me through a wonderful conversation, very rich, and the fact that it was designed more as a conversation and dialogue makes my job much easier. Thank you.
It was a joy.
Very
Thank
kind.
you so much.
Very kind.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Take care.
bye-bye. Bye all. Bye-bye.